The windmill tower wasn't supposed to save anyone anymore. It stood rusted and forgotten on a lonely ridge miles from the nearest road, its blades frozen in place like the bones of some dead machine. But buried beneath that tower was a hidden base someone had built decades earlier, a place meant to survive the worst winters. And that secret shelter would end up saving my sister and me after we were thrown out into the cold with nowhere left to go. The night everything fell apart started quietly, almost politely, which somehow made it worse. Mrs. Carter sat at the kitchen table counting bills from her wallet, her fingers sliding across the money with the kind of careful focus she usually reserved for balancing the electric bill. And without even looking at us, she said, "You turned 19 last year, Liam. The state payment stopped. We can't keep you anymore." That was it. No argument. No explanation. Just a decision delivered like the end of a business contract. I stood there in the doorway of the kitchen where my sister Ava and I had eaten silent dinners for nearly 8 years, trying to understand how someone could erase nearly a decade of our lives with one sentence. Mr. Carter sat in the living room behind us with the television murmuring quietly, pretending to watch the news even though the volume was too low to hear anything clearly. He didn't turn around. He didn't say a word. In that moment it felt like we had already disappeared from their lives. Ava was 13 then, thin and quiet in that way kids sometimes become when they learn early that speaking up doesn't change anything. I expected her to cry or argue or ask where we were supposed to go, but instead she walked calmly to the small hallway closet where we kept our things and pulled out 2 black garbage bags, the same kind Mrs. Carter used for yard waste. She began folding her clothes carefully, placing each item inside, as if she were packing for a trip instead of being pushed out into the late October cold. Watching her scared me more than anything Mrs. Carter had said. Ava used to cry when things went wrong. Back when she first came to the Carter's house at 5 years old, she cried almost every night. But somewhere along the way that had stopped. The system had taught her that feelings were dangerous to show in front of people who didn't care about them. I wanted to say something to the Carters then, to remind them of the birthdays they ignored, or the school meetings they skipped, or the Christmas mornings when Ava sat near the window hoping someone might remember to put something under the tree for her. But what would have been the point? People like them didn't see us as children. We were a monthly payment that had finally expired. We left before sunrise. The cold hit us the second we stepped outside the house. Damp wind pushing through our jackets, as if the world itself wanted to remind us how unprepared we were. Our entire lives fit into 2 trash bags. Ava carried one over her shoulder, and I carried the other as we walked down the gravel road leading out of town. Behind us, the Carter's porch light flicked off. It felt like someone closing a door forever. "Where are we going?" Ava asked after we had walked for almost an hour. Her voice was flat and calm, the voice of someone who had already accepted that the answer might not be good. "North," I told her. She looked up at me, confused. "Why north?" "Less people," I said, which wasn't exactly a plan, but it was the only one I had. If we stayed near town, someone would notice eventually. A teacher, a neighbor, maybe a police officer asking questions. Once social services got involved, they would discover that I was 19 with no job, no address, and no legal right to keep my younger sister with me. They would take her away and place her somewhere else, maybe another foster home, maybe a group facility miles from wherever I ended up. I had seen that happen before. At a group home where I once lived, there had been a brother and sister who promised each other they would never be separated. The system split them up within a month. The boys stopped speaking entirely after that. I refused to let that happen to Ava. If staying together meant disappearing into the wilderness for a while, then that's what we would do. By the time the town disappeared behind us, the paved road had turned to gravel, and the gravel eventually became a narrow dirt track leading into the forests of northern Wisconsin. The trees were already losing their leaves, skeletal branches rattling in the wind like dry bones. Every step carried us farther from the world we knew and deeper into a place where no one would think to look for 2 kids trying to survive alone. We walked until the sun dipped low behind the hills, and the temperature dropped fast enough that I could see my breath in front of me. That night we found a broken hunting shelter tucked between a cluster of pine trees. It wasn't much, 3 wooden walls and a rusted tin roof, but it blocked the wind enough that we could curl up inside and pretend we had somewhere safe to sleep. I stayed awake most of the night listening to the forest. Every snap of a branch made me tense. Every rustle in the dark sounded like footsteps coming to drag Ava away. She slept beside me wrapped in both our jackets, shivering quietly even in her dreams. The next morning frost coated the ground like powdered glass. Our breath hung in the air, and Ava's hands were so stiff she struggled to tie her boots. That was the moment I realized something I had been trying not to think about since we left town. We weren't just homeless. Winter was coming fast, and if we didn't find something better than a broken hunting shack, the cold alone would kill us before anyone ever noticed we were gone. That afternoon, while digging through the trash bag looking for another layer of clothing, my fingers brushed against a folded piece of paper tucked inside an old envelope I had carried for years without paying attention to it. The paper was brittle and yellow with age. When I unfolded it, I saw rough pencil lines drawn across the page, marking hills, a narrow stream, and a ridge trail leading toward a small circle near the edge of the map. Next to that circle, someone had written 3 words in faded handwriting that changed everything: Old Windmill Base. I stared at that map for a long time while the cold wind whispered through the trees around us. And for the first time since the Carters told us to leave, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel again so soon: hope. The windmill didn't look like the kind of place that could save anyone's life. From the ridge, it stood like a rusted skeleton against the gray November sky, its metal blades frozen in place as the cold wind pushed through the hills. Ava and I had been following the old map for nearly 2 days by then, hiking through dense forest and across frozen creeks, hoping the faded circle marked Old Windmill Base actually meant something. When the tower finally appeared above the trees, I felt both relief and doubt at the same time. Up close, it looked abandoned for decades. The blades were bent, one hanging crooked, and the circular stone base was covered in weeds and moss. Ava looked at me and frowned. "This is what we walked all this way for?" she asked. I checked the map again, lining up the ridge and the stream below us. "It has to be," I said, though I wasn't fully convinced. At first the place looked completely useless, but as I walked around the base, something caught my attention. One section of the stone platform looked different, slightly raised, with dirt packed around the edges. I brushed away the leaves and mud with my hands until the outline of a metal hatch appeared beneath the grime. Ava crouched beside me. "That's a door," she whispered. The handle was rusted but still attached. I pulled on it, and at first it didn't move. Then with a loud groan the hinges finally gave way, and the hatch slowly lifted open. A rush of still, cold air rose from below. Inside was a narrow ladder disappearing into darkness. "Stay up here," I told Ava. "I'll check first." I climbed down carefully until my boots touched solid ground about 10 feet below. When my eyes adjusted to the dim light coming from above, I realized this wasn't just a hole under the windmill. It was a shelter. Thick wooden beams reinforced the stone walls, and shelves lined one side of the chamber. In the center sat a heavy cast iron wood stove covered in dust, but still intact. "Ava," I called up, trying to keep my voice steady. "You should see this." She climbed down quickly and stopped beside me, staring around in disbelief. "This is a house," she said softly. It really was. There was a stack of old firewood tucked beneath a tarp and a narrow passage leading to a second small chamber where water dripped slowly from the ceiling into a shallow stone basin. Vent pipes ran up toward the surface, probably through the windmill tower itself, letting fresh air circulate without letting snow block the openings. Whoever built this place had clearly planned for harsh winters. While exploring, I found a small metal box hidden behind one of the shelves. Inside were a few carefully wrapped items: a faded photograph, a worn leather notebook, and a folded letter. The photograph showed a young woman standing beside the windmill decades earlier. On the back someone had written a name: Clara Hayes, 1964 ***. I unfolded the letter and read it slowly while Ava leaned over my shoulder. Clara explained that she had built the shelter herself after running from a dangerous situation. She spent 2 years turning the abandoned windmill base into a place where she could survive alone, living there through 3 brutal winters before eventually leaving to start a new life somewhere else. The final line made Ava go quiet. "If you found this place," Clara had written, "then you probably needed it as much as I once did. I hope it keeps you alive." I looked around the underground room again. The stove, the water basin filling drop by drop, the thick walls protecting us from the freezing wind outside. For the first time since we were thrown out, it felt like we had a real chance to survive the winter. Winter arrived faster than we expected, but by the time the first heavy snow covered the hills, Ava and I were ready. The windmill shelter became our world. Every morning I climbed the ladder to gather fallen branches while Ava melted snow and kept the stove burning. The thick stone walls held the warmth better than we ever imagined, and the steady drip of water in the back chamber meant we never ran out. Some nights the wind roared so loudly above us that the metal blades of the windmill screeched like something alive, but underground we stayed safe. Weeks passed, then months. The shelter that Clara Hayes built decades earlier truly did what she promised in her letter. It kept us alive. By the time the snow finally began to melt and patches of green returned to the hills, Ava and I were stronger, calmer, and no longer just surviving. Before leaving the windmill, I placed Clara's photograph and letter back in the metal box, along with a short note of our own. I wrote that 2 strangers had found her shelter when they needed it most, and that her hidden windmill base saved us through the hardest winter of our lives. Then we closed the hatch and stepped into the sunlight, knowing that somewhere behind us, beneath that old rusted tower, a quiet refuge still waited for whoever might need it next.